Hello and welcome to Storytime with Vicky. Tonight I'm going to take you to a place deep within an enchanted forest, where the trees whisper secrets, a lonely cottage glows beneath the moonlight, and the magic lives inside every shadow. This is a story of a baby princess born under a silver star, a mirror that speaks the truth, and a queen whose beauty hides a wicked heart. So get cozy, snuggle under your blanket, and let your imagination drift away. Because once upon a time, in a kingdom far, far away, our story begins. The Mirror and the Apple. Long ago, in a kingdom bordered by deep forests and silver rivers, there lived a queen who wished for a child more than anything else in the world. One winter's day, as snow drifted softly past her window, she pricked her finger while sewing. A single drop of red fell upon the white snow outside. Gazing at the bright contrast, she whispered, "If only I had a daughter with skin as fair as snow, lips as red as a rose, and hair as dark as the midnight sky." Not long after, her wish came true. A little girl was born, and she was named Snow White. But joy and sorrow often travelled together. The gentle queen grew ill and passed away before Snow White was old enough to remember her face. The king, grieving and lonely, eventually remarried. His new queen was strikingly beautiful and carried herself with perfect grace. Yet behind her beauty lay a heart that measured worthiness in reflections. The new queen possessed a tall mirror framed in silver vines, had been crafted by a mysterious artisan, and had answered truthfully whenever she spoke to her. Each morning she would ask, "Mirror of silver, clear and bright, who is the fairest in this land of light?" And each morning it replied, "You, my queen, are the fairest in the land." For many years that answer pleased her. Meanwhile, Snow White grew. She was gentle in spirit, kind to servants, and fond of wandering the palace gardens. Her laughter carried like birdsong. As she blossomed to a young woman, her beauty became the kind that did not demand attention, but quietly warmed those around her. One morning, as Snow White braided flowers into her hair, the queen stood before her mirror and asked the usual question. But this time the mirror answered, "You are fair, my queen, it is true, yet Snow White is fairer still." The words struck like a winter wind. From that day forward, envy gnawed at the queen's thoughts. She watched Snow White more closely. She noticed how sunlight seemed to favour her, and how the stable boy smiled when she passed, and how even the birds perched near her when she sang. Jealousy is a seed that grows quickly when watered by pride. At last, unable to bear it, the queen summoned a royal huntsman. "Take the girl into the forest," she commanded. "You know the deep woods where no one walks. Leave her there." The huntsman's heart tightened, for he had known Snow White since she was small, yet he dared not refuse. He led Snow White through the forest between towering pines. She walked trustingly beside him, admiring the moss and the wild flowers. When they reached a clearing far from the palace roads, the huntsman stopped. His hands trembled. "My lady," he said softly, "I cannot do what I was told." Snow White looked at him in confusion. "You must run," he continued. "Run deep into the forest. Do not return to the castle. The queen's heart has grown dark." Fear flickered across Snow White's face, but she did not weep. Instead, she thanked him for his mercy and fled amongst the trees, her pale dress flashing between trunks till she vanished from sight. The huntsman returned alone, and the queen assumed her command had been obeyed. Snow White ran until her breath came in gasps. The forest changed as she moved deeper. The trees grew thicker, their branches weaving overhead like a cathedral of leaves. Shadows lengthened, and strange sounds rustled through the undergrowth. At last, exhausted, she stumbled into a small clearing and saw something unexpected. A tiny cottage, nestled between tree roots and mossy stones. It looked as though it had grown there rather than been built. Smoke curled gently from a narrow chimney. Snow White hesitated, but hunger overcame her caution. She knocked softly. No answer came. The door creaked open at a touch. Inside, everything was small but orderly. 7 little chairs stood around a wooden table. 7 plates, 7 cups, 7 neatly made beds lined the far wall. Snow White's stomach growled. She tasted a small spoonful from each plate, careful not to take too much from anyone. She drank a sip of water. Then, overwhelmed by weariness, she lay across the beds, finding none long enough, until she finally curled up across them all and fell into a deep sleep. At dusk, the cottage door opened. 7 companions entered, each carrying a lantern and tools for mining precious stones from the nearby hills. They were small in stature but strong in limb, their beards dusted with earth and sparkle. They paused when they saw the door ajar. Inside they noticed crumbs, shifted chairs, and finally the sleeping girl. They gathered around her in astonishment. "She looks like winter's first snowfall," murmured one. "And yet alive as spring," said another. When Snow White awoke, she found 7 curious faces peering at her. She sat up quickly and apologized for entering their home uninvited. She told them her story of the mirror, the jealousy, and the forest. The companions listened in silence. At last, the eldest amongst them said, "You may stay here if you wish. We work in the mountains each day. If you keep the cottage tidy and tend the hearth, we shall keep you safe." Snow White's eyes shone with gratitude. And so a new life began. Each morning the 7 companions set off at sunrise, singing low work songs as they disappeared along the forest path. Snow White swept the floors, washed the cups, and filled the cottage with warmth. She learned to bake bread from the forest grains and gather herbs for stew. In the afternoon she would sit outside, telling stories to curious rabbits and stitching small curtains for the windows. Laughter returned to her days. Back at the palace, the queen once again stood before her mirror. "Mirror of silver, clear and bright, who is the fairest in the land of light?" The mirror replied, "Snow White still lives, deep in the forest, and she is fairer than you." The queen's fury blazed hotter than ever. If the forest had not taken the girl, she would see to it herself. Disguising herself as a travelling peddler, she filled a basket with bright ribbons and set off towards the woods. She found the cottage easily. Envy has a way of guiding those who carry it. Snow White alone heard a knock. An old woman stood at the door, bent and smiling. "Lovely ribbons," the woman croaked, for a girl with dark as hair as yours." Snow White, remembering kindness, welcomed her inside. As the queen laced a ribbon round Snow White's bodice, she pulled it too tight. Snow White gasped, struggling for breath, and fell unconscious. The queen departed swiftly. When the 7 companions returned, they sensed something was wrong at once. They found Snow White, pale, upon the floor. Working together, they loosened the ribbon, and fresh air filled her lungs. Slowly, her eyes opened. They warned her sternly never to open the door again. But envy does not surrender easily. The queen returned to her mirror and learned Snow White yet lived. Again she disguised herself, this time as a comb seller, and slipped a poison comb into Snow White's hair. Again, the companion saved her. Finally, in desperation, the queen prepared a shining apple, rosy and perfect. Half of it she left untouched, the other half she infused with sleeping poison. She disguised herself once more. Snow White, though cautious, could not resist the apple's beauty. When the old woman bit the white half to prove it safe, Snow White believed her and bit the red side. At once she fell to a deep, unmoving sleep. When the companions found her, no remedy stirred her. She looked as though she simply rested. Grief filled the cottage. They could not bury her in the cold ground. Instead, they crafted a crystal casket and laid her within it upon a hill, bathed in sunlight. Forest creatures kept silent watch, and the 7 companions kept vigil in turns. Days passed. One afternoon, a young traveller on horseback passed through the forest. He had been journeying from distant lands, learning the ways of different kingdoms. His name mattered less than his nature. He was thoughtful and observant, more interested in stories than in conquests. He saw the glass casket gleaming in the clearing and approached quietly. Within lay Snow White. He listened as the 7 companions told a tale. "She has gone from us," said the eldest companion, sorrow in his voice. The traveller studied her gently, not with possession, but with respect. "May I carry her to my homeland?" he asked. "Not as a prize, but as someone to be honoured. I believe no life so kind should be forgotten." After much discussion and seeing the sincerity in his eyes, the companions agreed. As the casket was lifted, one of them stumbled on a tree root. The motion shifted Snow White slightly. The piece of apple lodged in her throat, loosened and fell away. She inhaled sharply. Colour rushed back to her cheeks. The companions cried out in astonishment. The traveller nearly dropped the casket in surprise. Snow White sat up slowly, confused but alive. Joy swept through the clearing like sunlight after rain. The 7 companions wept openly. The traveller laughed in disbelief. Snow White listened as they told her what had passed. When she learned of the queen's treachery, sorrow, not anger, filled her eyes. "I cannot return to the palace," she said softly, "but I do not wish to live in hiding forever." The traveller offered her a place in his homeland, not as a dependent, but as a partner in building something new. He spoke of villages that needed schools, of forests that needed protection, of people who valued fairness over vanity. Snow White looked to her 7 companions. "You gave me shelter when I had none," she said. "Will you visit?" They promised they would. And so Snow White chose a new path, not defined by fear, but by purpose. When news reached the queen that Snow White yet lived, her fury became wild and reckless. She rushed once more to a mirror of silver, clear and bright. But this time the mirror answered differently. "Beauty that harms cannot endure. Your reflection fades because your heart has turned upon itself." For the first time the queen saw not a rival, but her own bitterness staring back at her. Envy had consumed what she once valued most. Her power waned, not through magic, but through isolation. Servants whispered, advisors withdrew. In chasing perfection, she had driven away loyalty. And so her reign ended, not in fire or spectacle, but in loneliness, which is often the truest consequence of cruelty. Far away, Snow White flourished. In time, she and the traveller built a home near the edge of a wide meadow. The 7 companions visited often, bringing gemstones and laughter. Together they helped villagers prosper, teaching skills, sharing harvests, and protecting the forest that had once sheltered her. Snow White never forgot the woods, nor the lesson they held. Beauty that seeks admiration fades. Beauty that gives kindness grows. Years later, children would gather at her feet to hear the story of how she once slept beneath glass and awoke not to revenge, but to a second chance. And whenever winter snow fell softly across the land, those who knew her smiled at the memory of a girl with skin like snow, lips like roses, and a heart stronger than envy. For in the end, it was not her beauty that saved her, it was kindness. And kindness, unlike mirrors, never lies. And so, beneath the silver moon and the whispering trees, peace returned to the kingdom at last. The mirror fell silent. The forest cottage glowed warmly once more. And our princess, safe and brave, grew into her own kind of magic. Some stories end, but their magic lingers in our hearts forever. Thank you for stepping into this enchanted world with me tonight. If you enjoyed the story and would like to hear more magical tales, please subscribe and join me for our next adventure. Until next time, close your eyes, dream sweetly, and remember, happily ever after is closer than you think. Good night.